Hi, everyone. So the three types of representations in digital games that I'm going to talk about are basically three types of representations that you probably know quite well, because it's basically Persian trichotomy of symbols, indexes, and iconic representations. But there are some preliminary remarks. So first of all, my aim is not historical. So I'm not going to use, do an exegesis of pairs. I just want to use this trichotomy as it is understood today in order to see if it fits video games, fits digital games, and what can we do with it, basically. So I want to show that Persian trichotomy highlights some of the specific features of digital games, that it helps to pinpoint some of the specific features of digital games. And also I want to show that applying this trichotomy to games creates interesting distinctions within games that can be used in the process of classification. So I want to do a good classification or interesting classification that can be understood as a supplementary classification for other classifications using this trichotomy. And I will refer, as I said, to modern understanding of symbols, indexes, and icons, and I will in a second tell you what this modern understanding is. One point that I forgot to put in the presentation is that I don't want to create an impression that this trichotomy is all there is to representations. No. The only thing I want to say by this is this three types, it is good to differentiate between these three types. And it is good to understand representations as consistence of at least these three types. Maybe there are others. Maybe there is much more to say about representations. So let me start about explaining what I mean by this modern sense of these three types. So first of all, symbolic representations are to be understood as, well, basically symbolic representations are related to their targets by some convention. So the most obvious conventions is basically linguistic convention. So symbols like proper names, for example, refer to their targets because of the linguistic conventions that ties them to their targets. But of course, there are many other conventions that tie symbols to their targets. But convention is the key. There has to be some kind of convention interpreter and the convention in order for symbolic representation to work. Indexical representations are related to their targets causally. So basically, they are caused by their targets. They are the effects of their targets. So the best example of indexical representation that is basically caused by its targets are, for example, animal tracks. Animal tracks are our representations of an animal which, I don't know, ran a second ago through the forest. But why they are representations of the animal? Because they are caused by the animal. So relation of cause and an effect, physical cause and an effect, creates indexical representations. And iconic representations are related to their targets by a non-trivial homomorphism between them and the representation. So again, what I mean by it is that simply there is a similarity in structure between the target and the representation. And the similarity is non-trivial. What I mean by non-trivial is that, well, a given representation isn't similar to everything like that. There's only a selected number of things that the representation is similar to. And again, a very good example of iconic representation, one that should be understandable to everyone, is simply a map. A map is something that is related to the land it maps, to the terrain it maps, because it's structurally similar to the terrain. But it's not similar in a sense that satellite photo is similar. You need some cognitive skills to understand that this map is a map of a given terrain. For example, that this is a city map for Berlin and not other city. But of course, this similarity between city map of Berlin and Berlin isn't a convention. It's something that could be, in principle, recognized by a sophisticated cognitive agent, even if the agent didn't know the convention. You could basically, if you can decode the map, you can get this. Oh yeah, there's a similarity. For example, this is probably the river, and stuff like that. So these are three types. Now, How do I want to apply this to games? First of all, there are two differences that we have to add to the mix. So we'll create actually more categories. So first of all, representations in games can be internal or external. What I mean by this is, again, rather simple. When representations are external, it means that their target lies outside of the game. And when they are internal, it means that their targets lie inside of the game. You will see some examples. I believe it'll be easy. But also, representations can be diegetic or non-diegetic. So representation may be part of an interface, for example, or they might be part of the game world. So having these possibilities, we have now we can basically present some different possibilities. I will start with the lower right corner because it'd be easier to explain. So let's start with symbolic representations. They can, again, be diegetic and internal, non-diegetic and internal, and so on. You will see. So first of all, non-diegetic external symbolic representations are, for example, company logos or country names. Now, these are basically non-diegetic because they appear inside of the game. Like good example of it is, for example, all the company logos you can see in, I don't know, FIFA games, and they refer to the external targets of a given company or products. Well, that's the point. If someone, if the players didn't refer them to their real targets, the advertising wouldn't work. If someone thought, oh, it's just a fictional Coca-Cola, not a real Coca-Cola, it wouldn't work, right? So people understand it as referring to external stuff. Now, an example of non-diegetic internal representations is, for example, Aperture Science logo. That is a logo of a fictitious company in Portal. That is, the company is inside the game, it's internal to the game. It's non-diegetic because it's in the game, for example, on billboards and stuff like that. Or the @ sign in Rogue, where basically the @ sign in Rogue refers to the avatar. You manipulate this sign, but of course, again, it is a symbolic representation, but not linguistic representation. It is a symbolic representation because you have to refer to a convention in the manual, which will tell you that this is the avatar symbol. If any of you started to play Rogue, the original Rogue, with any explanation of the symbols, you know how hard it is. How it basically needs this convention, the outside convention that will tell you what the signs are. So now let me proceed further. External diegetic symbolic representation is, for example, the time of day. Some games, it's not a very popular feature, but some games have real time of day on the inside of the game, inside of the interface. I believe some of the Civilization games had this. Some interactive fictions have this. So basically, in this point, something that is part of the interface is a symbolic representation of something outside of the game that is real time of the day. Which may be important if you are scared that you will lose track of time. And diegetic internal. This category is the most interesting. There are many possibilities. For example, ammunition counter. This is something that is part of the interface, but tells you about the internal feature of the game. Or color coding in games. For example, that something shows you that this is a blue potion, that is a red potion. This is a convention, of course. There's nothing that makes us color code stuff like that. So this is a convention that tells you that the internal object of the game is this or that. Or experience level is a good example of a diegetic symbolic representation of a certain important mechanic. And this last example, experience level, is a very, very interesting one because it is an example of a symbolic representation that basically is in the game, and actually the player interacts only with this representation. Experience is only given by this representation. There's no experience that is seen or perceived in any other way. So compare it to the ammunition counter. With ammunition counter, if you really wanted, you could count the shots in your pistol. You wouldn't have to have the ammo count. But if you didn't have basically experience level indicator, you wouldn't know what your experience is basically, because this is a tacit mechanic that is given to you only by this symbolic representation. So this is an example of this things that are specific to games and that are interesting because this sort of classification basically shows them to us. So let's proceed to iconic representations. They are, again, 4 possibilities. I hope that they will be, some of them will be obvious. So diegetic internal iconic representation is a minimap. If I have a minimap, it is a part of the interface, and it basically shows me something about the internal structure of the game. Of course, non-diegetic internal representation is an in-game map, which is not a part of the interface. Like, for example, in, I forgot the name, in many flight simulators, a map is shown inside of the game. Like, for example, it lays on the table, and someone shows you that the mission structure on the map. A painting of a game character, another example of an iconic representation that is structurally similar to the character and is inside the game. So it refers to something internal, and it's not part of the interface. So now let's go to diegetic external representation that is iconic, button pictures. So if you have an interface, and a part of the interface is basically showing you the button pictures, which is oftentimes, games oftentimes have that. So basically what it does is just by using the similarity of interface pictures to the real pad pictures or to the real keyboard. So basically it refers to the external object by way of showing something similar, but it is a part of interface. And the most interesting category is, of course, non-diegetic external iconic representation, and these are all the models and simulations in our games. Basically, games are very good at it, and most of the games we play comprise of iconic simulations, of iconic representations of this type, that is, simulations or models. Some people use these terms interchangeably, models and simulations, but the difference I refer to when I basically present them like this is that simulation is simply a much more primitive model. So simulation is something that gives you the same outputs for the same inputs, but model is something that is also structurally, internally similar to the thing that it's simulating. So, as you can see, many 3D objects in the games are basically 3D models or physical models. Or, for example, some dynamical structures in games are, for example, iconic representations, I don't know, of economy of a country or of a city and stuff like that. So now let's go to indexical representations, which, as far as I know, is the most surprising category when it comes to video games. Many people asked me before I had this talk, what do I exactly mean when I say that some targets external to game cause something in the game, that they are the causes of something in the game? Well, the idea basically is that let's go through it. So, for example, energy bar is an diegetic internal indexical representation. Why? Because the energy bar is causally connected to the mechanic inside of the game. There is a causal connection. If there wasn't a causal connection, the energy bar wouldn't work the way it works. Of course, it is connected computationally, but also causally in the physical structure of the computer. So an example of non-diegetic causal connection, beaten or bruised characters in, for example, in games, where basically they started to be there's more and more blood on them and stuff like that. And it just shows us that they are more beaten. But this is, again, a sign and a representation of being beaten that is causally connected to the mechanic internal to the game. Now, a diegetic external indexical representation is a scanned unit photograph in a game. For example, let's say that we have a strategy game where someone scanned a photograph of a real unit, like it's a history game or something like that. Then there is a causal connection between this person and its representation in a game, because, well, it's a the photograph was physically created by the person causing some material to change the shape, and the scanning process is again a causal connection between the photograph and between the game. So there's a real causal link between the object and the digital representation. And of course, this is the most interesting category: non-diegetic external representations, things like photogrammetry or laser scanning or 3D scanning, pretty new technologies that are used. Vanishing Novitena Carter that was mentioned today uses this. So basically what we have is that, for example, people use some kind of techniques to measure tracks of real tracks and then transport them into games, or basically real places and transport them to, or 3D scan objects. Of course, sound sampling is another example of a non-diegetic external representation. Samples in games are something that were caused by the objects from which we sample them. And of course, texturing. Well, not all textures, but some textures are basically scanned from reality or photographed in the reality. So now, let's leave this table and get to another one, because now when I basically explained to you how these representations work, we can basically ask another question that produces, in my opinion, interesting possibilities. And basically, what about combinations of this? Representations. For example, are there representations of only one type or of all the three types? So let's go through all possibilities. If something is symbolic, iconic, and indexical representations at the same time, it is possible. For example, Nürburgring in racing games. It says that it's Nürburgring. It is scanned laser. For example, it's laser scanned, like in Forza on GTA or Gran Turismo. Sorry, and it's an indexical because it's iconic because it's very similar to the real thing. Another example is when something is a symbolic representation and iconic representation. That is, it says that it's Bruce Lee. My example is Bruce Lee motion capture. It says that it's Bruce Lee. It's iconic because it moves exactly like we remember Bruce Lee in the movies moved. But of course, the motion capture was done on an actor who is only similar to him, so it's not an indexical representation. There are, I think, 2 new games coming that use this. So again, another example, something that is symbolic representation and indexical representation, that is, it says that its target is this, and it was taken from this target, but it's not iconic, so it's not actually structurally similar. It happens when basically our scan is very bad, like this. This is a Game Boy mono representation of one of the fighters in Mortal Kombat. I don't even know which one of the women fighters, but I'm not sure which one because it's so bad. But it's a scan still. Again, if you have a symbolic representation only, then we have something that it only says that it is connected to the target, but it's not similar to it or hasn't been taken from it in any way. So again, an example, I use it as a city name in an 8-bit game. With basically it says San Diego and many parts of states there. But even a better example will be Dope Wars that we had here, where basically there are only names that refer to, for example, substances that are sold. And an example where something is iconic, is an iconic representation that is similar to the target, that was taken from the target, but it's not symbolic. That is, it doesn't say that it is a target. Vanishing Novitena Carter that was mentioned today, it's basically laser scan, not laser scan, but the technique was photogrammetry. It's basically a copied part of Polish landscape, but it says that it's a fictitious piece of America. But you can basically walk in Vanishing Novitena Carter and know your way in the Polish landscape. So it's a good iconic representation if you want a hike. Or GTA 5, which basically, of course, copies Los Angeles pretty well because it uses actual photographs and copies them very precisely. But of course, it doesn't say it's Los Angeles. It's a fictitious place called Los Santos. So it's iconic and indexical, but not symbolic. An example of something that is not symbolic and not indexical, that is, it doesn't say what it is, it wasn't taken from anything, but it's still similar to something, is something that is procedurally generated, like in Proteus. That basically, it cannot be said to be indexical in any possible sense, but still it resembles trees and stuff. And an example of something that is not symbolic, not similar to anything, but still was taken from something, in this way, it is a representation of this. Is any highly processed sound? A good example of this is a sound of a transformation of a character in Destiny, which the creator told was basically vegetables sizzling on the pan in his house. But there are many things like that are used in sound processing. And of course, the last category is pretty interesting. Can there be something that is not representational in any sense? So basically, it doesn't say what it is. It was procedurally generated, and it doesn't resemble anything. So it would probably have to be, I don't know, white noise or something like that. That's a good question. I'm not sure here. It might be a thing for discussion. So I don't have the time. It's a discussion. So let me skip one thing that I wanted to do. And thanks for it.
All right. Thank you, Pawel. Any questions?
Hi, thank you for that. I think this approach is fruitful. I'm going to be doing something similar tomorrow that will resonate, I think, with some of the things you said here. Let me just make a couple of points and ask for you to comment on them, and then maybe have a question. The categories you assign to some of those symbols seem arbitrary. For instance, the bruised and battered characters. That could be iconic to bruised and battered characters outside the game, right? And you had it in another category there.
Right.
So sometimes there seems to be conflicting targets. A player might perceive a particular symbol in the game to refer to something, and during the course of play, the player finds out that's the wrong target. It doesn't work. Would you say that's likely the case?
I would say that, yeah, you're right that the reference might be more than one. So, for example, it might refer to the internal mechanic and to the external, but I'm not sure about a conflict here. I would say that it's perfectly normal for some representations to be basically representations of 2 or 3 types. But you're right that sometimes it might be a conflict. I'm not sure about the example now, but as a possibility, there is a possibility of conflict, and that's a good question. Which representation wins? And my and my answer is that symbolic representation always wins.
I agree with you. Another example is a king in chess, which starts out iconic, I think, in many players' mind. I'm going to move this piece as though it were a real king, and they find out that's not the way you win at the game.
Yeah.
The game teaches them the symbolic interpretation.
Yeah.
My other question is, how about the game itself? You've broken down the game into the parts. Are you able to classify the game as a symbol of something or as an iconic representation of something? The game as a whole. Do you have any comments?
I understand the question.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do it. I mean, I will tell you why. Well, I think that we might select certain games that might be, for example, maybe if I took SimCity and I said, well, this is an iconic representation of a modern city, maybe it's a good idea. But with some selected games, it might be a good approach. But I will prefer to basically cut games into many aspects and say, well, this aspect is a representation of this thing, and this represents this thing. So, for example, game mechanics might be a representation of economy of a country, but by sheer luck, it might be also a representation of some machine. It's possible, and so on. But I guess that some selected games might be specifically so tied, for example, to an external target that we might say, oh, this as a whole is a good representation of this, but only in selected cases then.
Thank you. Questions?
I'm new here. So am I right that all of the targets of the representations that you talked about are somehow physical things, whether inside or outside of the game?
No.
Yeah.
Internal. For example, game mechanics are not treated as physical. They might be treated as computational relations. So no.
Well, I was wondering how you would handle representations of more abstract things like love or faith or fighting the man or something like this. I can imagine symbols that would represent those things, and I was wondering how they'd fit in your chart.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that if there exists something, if love exists as an object, It's probably, I don't know, the definition I would go for is very naturalistic, that love is the set of all the people who are in love. So basically of all the parts. There's this relation that manifests itself, and there's a set of these people. And if I present something in game that refers to love, it refers to this set. But it might be not be a good answer. And in a sense that not everyone wants this definition. But I would say this framework just tells you this, just tells you how the representation works, in a sense that what are the supposed targets. And it doesn't try to answer ontological questions like what love really is. That's a different question, not for game studies. So if you know what love is, then I know how representation works. But this theory isn't aimed to answer this question, what love is, for example.
But one of the characters might have a little heart beating out of its chest or something, right? And that would represent, that would be representative.
It's a symbolic representation that needs a convention, because the heart is not similar to real hearts, and you have to know that hearts represents heart. This thing is a typical symbolic representation that needs the knowledge, the previous knowledge of a convention.
Okay.
Thanks. Got a queue of questions forming, so let's see how many we have time for.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask how you define for your categories the diegetic and the non-diegetic, because as the way I so far understand it, or as my understanding of that is that diegetic is everything that is, let's say, visible or that is there for the character in the game, and everything that's non-diegetic is not visible to him, but only maybe to me as a player. That is not, it's not part of the narrative, of the story, but it's outside of it. But from your examples, I had the feeling that, to my understanding, basically you used it exactly the other way around.
Oh, so maybe because I wanted to understand it the way you explained. So maybe I mixed up something.
Yeah, okay, that could.
But what I meant is diegetic is basically the part of the game world, and non-diegetic.
Okay,
yeah. Good. So, like, for example, maybe I mixed it. Did I mix it? Yeah, sorry, I mixed it. Yeah, totally right. Thanks for this. I just it's a stupid mistake. Sorry.
I'm relieved. I'm relieved that I didn't get it wrong.
Exactly. Yes. Sorry for that. Sorry.
Nevertheless, one more thing then, exactly here with the energy bar, because you said that the energy bar in the game is like because of the, let's say, computer mechanics or the program mechanics. It's causally connected. Yeah. But then isn't everything that I see on the screen, because, for example, the position of this character where he's currently in the game is just in the same way connected?
Not really. I mean, for example, there are lots of aspects of interface that are not causally connected to anything. They are only to inform you about something. So let me give you an example. Some of the stuff on the screen that tells you basically what the button presses are. They might not react to anything in the game. They are just displayed on the screen. So they are basically there. They are part of the interface, but they are not causally connected to anything. They are just displayed on the screen. They are not causally connected to any of your actions or any of your any of game mechanics. Informational, only part of the interface.
My question would be, I think in your terminology, Microsoft Flight Simulator would be Indexical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the reading we are talking about of Peirce triad is a very ontological one.
Yeah.
But we could turn Peirce himself into a pragmatist, which he was, and to say, well, science only becomes science when we use them for a certain purpose. Sure. I think that's the point where you also started. So I could say, if I would use Microsoft Flight Simulator, it's just resemblance of buttons and iconic signs. I push them and look what's happening. But if I'm one of the assassinators of 9/11s, I use it as an indexical sign of the plane I want to ride.
Yeah. Well, lot of things. first of all, if there is a if we're talking about iconic representations, then with iconic representations, as I said, I'm using this modern interpretation of it. So in the case of iconic representations, you have to have the use of it. So basically, yeah, I would say that with iconic representations, if some element of the game is used by the user as a representation, then it becomes a representation. A good example of it will be, my friend, for example, used Test Drive Unlimited to learn how to drive on Polish roads, although it happens in Miami, right? Not in Miami, or in Hawaii. So, so basically, why was she able to do is because there is an iconic resemblance that is good enough to learn how to drive. So, and I would say that it wasn't an iconic representation before she used it. So it had the potential to it, but it was used like this. And but with, for example, with Indexical or rather ontological. Indexical don't need any interpreter. So, for example, if there is I'm going with, for example, an interpretation like a Fred Dretske representation that, for example, if you cut the tree and look at the rings are there even if you didn't, if no one looked at these rings, they represent the age of the tree. So because they are there and they are causally connected by laws of nature. So I would go with this ontological representation for indexical, but epistemological for iconic.
But still, you would need the biologist to use them as signs.
Well, even if there was no biologist, the tree rings still are connected to the age.
Okay, one last question.
It is rather a comment, though. I think it's going to be interesting to see how sort of this maps onto simulation, if that's what's going to happen tomorrow. I would say, though, that I would side with that gentleman over there that says that there is an actual, first of all, I'm glad you said all this stuff about sort of indexical being a causal connection and therefore sort of being an ontological distinction that doesn't really need kind of interpretation in the sense that the symbolic does. But I would also say that everything you see there has a straight indexical relationship with computational states and the bare metal there. And you can't really get around that.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of other stuff happening here once you invoke causality, which can be or cannot be. I mean, it depends whether that's important or not. But you can't get rid of it and saying that only has a relationship with actions or anything. Since it's caused by the computer and particular states, then there's an indexical relationship all the time, just on a different level than what you're describing here.
My answer is good question. My answer would be that not all causal relations constitute a representational relation, and you're right that in this sense you need to see the reactions of interpreters. For example, I would say that it is a secondary relation or something like that, because we normally when we observe our speech acts, we never talk about these features as if they referred to physical aspects of the computer, for example. If let me give you an example. If I look at a texture and I tell someone, do you know that this texture was photographed near my home? Then he will say, oh wow, that's a representation of your home in a game. But if I said, do you know that this texture is actually electric current in my computer? Do you know that? He would say, yeah, sure. So what? I'm not saying that it refers to electric current. In our speech act, but it does. I know. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But still, in our speech acts, it is not reflected. And you're right in a sense that this model probably needs additional constraint to differentiate between this, because I would like to differentiate it because of the speech acts. So that's why I would like to differentiate this. But yeah, this model doesn't differentiate between this.
All right. Thank you very much, Pawel.
Thanks.